What's going on, everybody? Today, we're going to be introducing you to our first podcast of the second unit, titled Basic Principles of the Constitution. So let's get going. A couple of things that we're going to have to define, first of all, are things like Constitution. And what is it? Well, it's a written plan of government. The goal of a Constitution, then, is to balance all the parts of government to make sure everything runs smoothly, including the different branches of our government. Also, we need to begin by defining what a principle is. No, not the principle of the school, but rather a principle is defined as a rule or belief that helps guide a person's actions. So, some of you have maybe heard older adults discussing their principles on life, or they're not wanting to do something because it violates one of their principles. These are simply an idea that forms the basis of something. In our Constitution, there are commonly 6 principles of the United States, and we'll cover each one of them here today. So, first of all, let's talk about popular sovereignty. To do so, we'll break the word down. So, popular in government always means people, and sovereignty in government, as we learned in Unit 1, means the ability of a country to self-rule, or rule oneself. When combined, we have a definition that the people rule themselves. Within the United States, this principle is emphasized as we are a representative democracy. Some of our early leaders recognized this as they wrote the preamble, and later on, Abraham Lincoln wrote that a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That's an interesting quote, because if you think about it, as long as there are people on this earth and there is a government, the government will get its power from those people. And we can see that again in the preamble, in the first 3 words when they say, we the people. Let's take a minute now to trace the expansion of this principle through American history, and we can do so through the amendment or changes to the Constitution. In colonial times, only people with property could vote, meaning white men, and in the New England colony of Massachusetts, generally, those white men who attended church could vote. By the 1830s, though, all white men, regardless of church membership or even class, could vote. After the Civil War, as you see, and the ratification or passing of the 15th Amendment, voting rights are going to now be extended to black men, not black women, just black men. And in 1920, with the 19th Amendment, women are going to be granted the right to vote. And again with the 26th Amendment, voting rights were then extended to all Americans who are 18 years old. Well, that takes care of our first principle, so now we'll move on to the second one, limited government. Under the Constitution, the government can only do what the people want it to do. We introduced this to you last unit a little bit through the philosophy of John Locke and Rousseau, and that if government was not protecting the people, then those philosophers believed that the people then could change it. This was later called the social contract, or the government receives its power from the consent or votes of the governed or the people. The government then would be held accountable through the election process or ultimately the impeachment process, as well as other state and local democratic institutions. In all, the government's powers are limited by the Constitution. So now I want to offer you an opportunity to practice a little bit. Here's a fun little cartoon. Let's see if you can begin to apply some of your thinking about limited government to this cartoon. In other words, how might a limited government impact some public goods and services that we in this society have come to rely on in the 21st century? I'll give you a few minutes to practice and think. I'll come back to you in just a second. Okay, well, we've learned 2 principles, so let's keep going with the third one, separation of powers. Within the United States government, you have probably already learned that the government is divided. In other words, within the government, absolute power is not concentrated in any one person's or group's hand. Each of those branches of our government, then, are going to be responsible for the laws we've established differently. The legislative branch, then, is going to be responsible for, among other things, making laws. The executive branch is then responsible for enforcing the legislative branch's laws that they have agreed upon. Finally, the judicial branch is going to be responsible for interpreting or judging those laws as being either constitutional or unconstitutional. For our visual learners then, on this slide, you can begin to see how these branches act separate from each other, but interestingly, communicate or check and even balance each other's power. It might be a good idea for your notes if you pause the podcast now and recorded this visual in your notes and then push play when you're ready. Our next principle then is going to focus on that ability of one branch to both check the power of another branch and ultimately balance it with their own power. What's interesting here is that in order to get things done or accomplished according to the Constitution, all these branches must work together, which can be difficult, and this is actually a good thing because it lowers the risks that any one branch's power is abused, which again is what Locke, Rousseau, and some of our other founding fathers were afraid of. So again, for our visual learners, here's a chart that shows the specific ways our government's three branches are both separate from and check and balance each other. Please take a few minutes to record it in your notes and work to understand it. We'll do much more specific work in class later on in the unit. Okay, this seems like as good a time as any to insert another cartoon and take a bit of a break. I bet none of you ever looked at your parents through a specific principles of government way, huh? Well, perhaps now you can. Alright, let's move on to our next principle known as federalism. Federalism is where the power of our government and responsibility of our government is shared between our national and federal government and the 50 state governments and numerous local governments, those at a county or even a city level. Now, some of the powers of government are delegated or given to the national government, such as the power and responsibility of establishing foreign policy with both our allies and enemies or coining money for our country, whereas other powers are going to be reserved or kept by the state governments, like establishing and maintaining schools or conducting elections, and finally some powers are going to be shared between these two, such as raising taxes and building roads or highways. Let's take a look at the next slide here so you can see through a Venn diagram how they may look. So on the left side, you can see some of the powers delegated for the national government. Go ahead and record a few. Then you've got those powers for the 50 states. And finally, you have some of those shared powers between both the federal government and those states. Again, take a second, record a few in your notes. We'll do much more work with this in class, but I need you guys to be ready so that when we get to that point, you know what I'm talking about. Now, what's interesting about this principle is the way it's been tested or the times when either the federal government and state governments have disagreed with one another, like during the Civil War in the 1860s, or civil rights in the 1950s and 60s, or the more recent gay marriage rights battles across the country, and even the drug policies like that seen in a growing number of states including Colorado, Oregon, Washington, and now Ohio and New York. Generally speaking, this principle is reestablished by the federal government through force, so like the National Guard or military most commonly seen in the Civil Rights era, or through constitutional amendments like the Voting Rights Amendments I discussed earlier, or through court cases which we'll cover in greater depth later in the semester. If we were to lay all of these powers and responsibilities between the levels of government and branches of government out, it would look like this chart. It's kind of like a tic-tac-toe table. What's important to note here is that power generally flows from top down, but remember, when looking at the branches of government, power and responsibility flows back and forth, thanks to both the separation of powers principle and checks and balance principles discussed earlier. We'll discuss this specific piece more on a separate podcast, so I'll hold off on going into too much detail for just a bit. So visually speaking, federalism can be seen in the top left corner through the integration of public schools like that seen here in Little Rock, Arkansas, or even integrating colleges like that of the University of Mississippi in the 1960s in the lower right-hand corner, or even drug policies on marijuana or extending rights to gays and the LGBT community as depicted in the symbol in the lower left-hand corner. Well, we're down to our final principle of the Constitution, and it's called judicial review. Now, this involves the Supreme Court, So we must understand that the Supreme Court has 9 justices or judges on the bench, as it's known. These justices or judges are going to be appointed by the President and approved by the United States Senate. These justices can serve a life term, which is ultimately what the President wants, because the President, although restricted to 2 4-year terms, is going to, through a judge, have that president's legacy carried out well beyond the years that that president no longer is in office. These justices then are going to hear cases having to do specifically with the Constitution. Now, early in American history, the Supreme Court established this principle in which it has the power to review laws previously agreed to. These laws then would be passed by Congress, they could be laws passed by the states, or they could simply be executive actions that the president of the time is going to make. The Supreme Court then can declare any of these laws or actions unconstitutional, and that ultimately makes up the last principle of the Constitution, judicial review. If you guys have any questions, feel free to go ahead and save them, jot them down on your notes, or just bring them up in class as we'll discuss them the next time we see you. Thanks so much. Hope you guys have a good day. Bye-bye.